All right. Welcome to Philosophy of Origins, Metaphysics and Philosophy of Origins. And I think we already talked, before I went on my last little trip, about what philosophy was, how it's a broad category. It means the love of wisdom. But under philosophy, we have things like logic, the theory of right thinking. We have aesthetics, the art of critiquing. What is the good, the true, the beautiful? We had ethics, theory of right conduct, which I teach an entire class on, so I won't be doing that except as it relates to origins. Mostly what we're going to focus on in here is epistemology, which is a fancy word for theory of knowledge. And the first question epistemology asks is knowledge possible for humans? Can we actually even know anything? And maybe to warm you up a little bit, before we start talking about metaphysics, which is beyond the physical, beyond the material, can we know anything? And first of all, you'll notice this quickly in philosophy, we are definition junkies. We like to define things to death, because what you'll find out is you'll have these really in-depth conversations with people, and when all the dust and smoke is cleared, you realize you weren't even talking about the same thing, even though you might have been using the same words. For example, I have a lot of conversations with people from Eastern religions and philosophies, and we can be talking about the love of God and the immanence of God and all of this, but it turns out our very conceptions of God could be wildly diverse, what that means. And so I want to talk about the difference between knowing and believing. For this epistemology piece. So if I ask you, what do you know? I mean, what could you tell me? If you remember, that was one of my promises to you, that you would actually know less at the end of this class than you know right now. I mean, to be more accurate than what you think you know right now. I'm going to show you what you think you know is actually probably more of a belief. So start with that. What's the difference between knowledge and belief? And while I'm getting to, well, I won't make you tell me your names right now, but I'm trying to learn your names. Come on, yes?
I know how to tie my shoes, while I believe there's a state called Texas.
Oh.
Would that be?
Oh, how interesting.
It's the opposite, because the way you might tie your shoes might be different from somebody else's that they think they know. Right? I was going to be there. No matter what. What the heck?
Well, yeah, but Texas hasn't always been there either.
Is that what
And is Texas a place or a state of mind? Well, for many people,
it's a state of mind.
It is, right?
Because it used to be Mexico. That's a whole other
Right.
conversation.
So that's interesting that you use like an actual physical dexterity thing to describe knowledge. That kind of actually, I've never heard anyone use that example, because I'm thinking usually more abstract, intellectual knowing things, but yours was like a very concrete, practical tying your shoes. I like what you said, though, is you may, little k, know how to tie your shoes, but is there a big K knowing of shoe tying that would encompass all sorts of latching of shoes universally, right? And what would it mean to know how to do that? You know, when you think of like the old Victorian shoes, they would literally have to lace them up all the way up to their calves, you know, they actually have to have tools to function these things. And a lot of people today, the way they tie their shoes is to tie them without tying them, right? Where it appears tied, but it's not. And so that's, I'm totally wrecked this train into the ditch right now. But the point is, knowing and believing, these are things that I would say as being absolute, objective, universal sorts of things, where this would be more of our subjective approach two things. So let me just start by that distinction of objective and subjective. Because we're going to come across this a lot in this class. There'll be a huge debate between philosophers about what we can and what we cannot know. And I've been doing this for a while now, and I think I only know like 3 things. Like capital K, no. 3 things. I believe millions of things. And I live most of my life by beliefs. But as far as knowledge goes, an objective, absolute, not depending on me or my perceptions or how I feel, I only know of very few things. I used to think I knew 5 things, but then when people asked me about them, I realized I could only remember 3 at any given time. So I'm just going to say I know 3 things. Do you know what they are? Do you want to know what they are?
Your name?
No, that's my name. This isn't even my real name. Do you know in Revelations, I believe 22, it says Christ is going to give us a white stone with our name written in it that only he and you will know? That will be my true name. That's when I'm really going to find out who I am. Right now, I'm just going with this social construct name my parents gave me. It shows something about my ancestry, where my people came from, those sorts of things. But those are all just like incidentals, right? That's not core, essential, capital K, no. That's like little K, no. I know I exist. I was actually in church on Sunday, and someone was trying to prove that humans exist. And it was actually one of my former students, and they were preaching. They did a great job, Pete Vick, and I loved it. But I told him afterwards I was thoroughly unconvinced by your apologetic of self-existence, because all his reasons to say why we actually are here in this room and not just some illusion or fantasy in somebody's mind didn't work for me. I mean, for all I know, we are just in a dream within a dream. But as I was pondering how I was unconvinced by his apologetic of self-existence, what I realized was there was a me questioning, or there was a me not being convinced by his arguments. And there being a me that was not convinced was evidence or knowledge of self-existence. And that's kind of a variation of Descartes' theme of I think, therefore I am. Whether you're thinking clearly or being deceived, there is still a you that is being conscious. But if I'm not thinking, if I'm not being consciously aware, I don't actually even know if I exist or not. I'm just kind of floating down in this like mode of life. So self-existence. And since I know I exist, as long as I'm thinking I exist, it means that I can know things. So self-existence that knows things. And that's 2 things, which means I'm a self that exists, that can know things, which means I can know more than 2 things, which is 3 things. But now it just gets silly, right, at this point. Besides that, it's all belief for me, baby. I mean, for all I know, we're in some holodeck somewhere, right? But there's still a me in this holodeck. Now, this may not be my actual form, this may not be what I physically look like, etc., but there is a conscious awareness of this self in this avatar at this time. Fascinating. Beliefs, that could be something as simple to, you believe, you know, we're on this ball that's spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, whipping around a star at 67,000 miles an hour, that's whipping around the black hole at 1.3 million miles an hour. I mean, it just gets, 500,000 miles an hour, and then the Milky Way itself is moving at 1.3 billion miles an hour around who knows what. But see, that's all belief. I don't know that. I believe that based on science, NASA, all these other things. But from my perspective, I mean, it might as well be a flat earth, right? When you look out and you see everything move around you, and you see why that would have been such an appealing belief, or way people thought they knew about the world. So we're going to talk a lot about what can we know, and the Greeks are really going to go at this. Some people believe we know through the external world. Other people believe we know through the internal world. And that's going to be our first big split in Greek philosophy. Now, to back up a little, lots of other people have had philosophy in their histories, including China, India, Africa, the Americas, the Middle East, Egypt, right? The repository of all this ancient knowledge, and even the Hebrews. In fact, some people would want to say we should go back all the way to Solomon. You know, why don't we start with him for Western philosophy? Or he was supposed to be the wisest man who ever lived, especially in a Christian school context. People might think, why don't we start there? How did Solomon get his wisdom?
From God.
Right, so this is why he doesn't really get thrown in with these other philosophers like the ancient Greeks, because his didn't come through observing the world or the turning of the planets or these sorts of things. His came through like this divine insight given him directly from God, almost more like an intuitive type knowledge, a direct link. And so I really wouldn't even call him a philosopher as much as maybe like a mystic or something that was just receiving this divine knowledge or insight. Now then he had to make decisions to apply it, but the wisdom itself, that knowledge was coming from God. The Greeks, on the other hand, had a very different idea of God or gods, right? Unlike the Hebrews, who were monotheists, they were polytheists. But the philosophers even thought like, well, polytheism for the common people, but let's get real. Do we really believe there's these zoomorphic gods, these bigger than life humans? And so we're going to get into that discussion and why not all philosophers made it. Some of them were actually killed because of their beliefs that were contrary to their culture. Another interesting aspect about the Greeks is that I think geography actually had a lot to do with them becoming philosophers. If you're familiar with Greece, it's made up of very mountainous, and there's lots of like valleys and peninsulas. And so the cities, they were like city-states. So imagine, instead of thinking of yourself as like an American or a Californian, you saw yourself as a San Diegan or a Santian. And that was your identity, that was your loyalty, that's how you saw yourself. And other city-states would have similar things. But because of geography, they were kind of provincial in their thinking in what was going on in that valley. But they didn't want to just be provincial, they wanted to look into the heavens. They wanted to think about how did we get here and why. Also, each city-state had its own patron gods and deities, unlike in Egypt and even in Palestine, where you had priestly caste. In Egypt, you had god kings, right? And in Israel, you had a theocracy, where God was basically saying, I'm in charge, here's the rules, here's who I'm putting as my representative on earth. The Greeks didn't have that. It was much more a humanistic view. In fact, so much so, and we'll get into this eventually, where the Greeks actually believe they made the gods in their own image. I mean, this is like secular humanism at its height, right? Where the Hebrews, their creation account begins with, and God made man in his image, male and female created he them. The Greeks said, no, we projected our image into the heavens, and that's what the gods are. And I think you can still get great psychological insight from the Greek gods and goddesses, right? In fact, a lot of our psychology terms today come from those Greek stories or myths, like the Electra complex or Oedipus complex, those sorts of things, which come from these Greek myths, but they give keen insight into human psychology, sexuality, our struggles, how we try to get through things. So we're going to start in ancient Greece, and this is actually, our first guy comes from Miletus, which is where modern day Turkey is, what the biblical, if you have maps in the back of your Bible, is called like Asia Minor. But along the coast of Turkey, in the city of Miletus, we had Thales. And we actually have like a date, which just cracks me up. May 28th, 585 BC, and I threw in, for good measure, sometime around noon, is the official starting date of Western philosophy. And for those of you that looked at the text, what happened May 28th, 585 BC? A lot of good reading going on. Okay, good to know. Get on that book. he predicted a solar eclipse. But now people had predicted solar eclipses before, but they had always been done through the gods, right? The oracle at Delphi, people could go in and look at chicken entrails and say, oh, an eclipse is coming next month, or whatever. So predicting eclipses was not new. What was new was he did it solely on empirical knowledge. Now, there's a big new word for you. Can anyone tell me what empiricism is? Yeah.
Just through numbers.
No. I don't know what that word would be, but that would be good. But we do have a group like that. That's the Pythagoreans, but they're coming. Empiricism. It means knowledge comes through the senses. Okay, sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry. Empiricism means what?
It's knowledge that comes through sense experience. So it assumes there is an external physical material world, and as we engage with that as individuals, we begin to take in and learn knowledge. Little k knowledge. Okay? We learn things about the world. And so he was simply observing the paths of the sun, moon, and stars. And by seeing their trajectories through the heavens, he was able to accurately predict when the moon would be blocking the sun. And he called it. Not through gods, not through prayer, not through anything else. It was simply by watching, paying attention, and keeping records, and he was able to make these incredibly stunning predictions. And so he begins, we call Thales the father of Western philosophy because of this and other things. He's using empirical reason. And Thales, like the next group of people I'm going to be talking about, are collectively known as the monist. But I would like to add to monist. Monist, think of monocle, which means one. They were monistic materialists. Because they believed there was one underlying substance, and I use a fancy German word in my book called Urstoff. I didn't come up with that. But Urstoff is that of which, or the substance from which everything comes. It's just easier to say Urstoff than the substance from which everything comes every time. So Urstoff, they believed this underlying substance was physical. And so Thales wanted to find out what was it that everything else came from. And this became his big quest. Now, in addition to this, with his observations, he realized that it may have to do more with like the seasons and climates rather than the gods. For example, Thales noticed if he wanted to invest in sending maybe a shipment of wine from up in Turkey, modern day Turkey, down to Egypt, now you could go to the dock and you could sacrifice a goat or sheep or whatever and pray to Poseidon that please give us prosperity and all that. Or you could curse the gods, you know, if you had no fear of them. But what he observed, whether you spit in Poseidon's eye or you sacrifice offerings to him, it had more to do with if you sailed in December or July, whether you were going to have a successful journey, not how many sheep or goats you offered. And so he's already, you can see how this is going to get him in trouble, but because there is no really strong theocracy in my elitist, he doesn't get off by the priest immediately. Okay, so, but this is where he's headed. And so what Thales is thinking, he's like, if we look at the world, what could possibly contribute to everything we see? And Thales came up with this idea that the underlying substance, the Urstoff, had to be water. Which is actually a really great guess. Because think of the ancient Greek world. We know that water can take both a solid, a liquid, and a gas form. And so what Thales is thinking is, he sees a cow, right? There's a cow grazing. It's eating grass, but from that grass, it's making flesh, meat, it's producing milk, but it's also producing urine. And he's thinking, how can grass be producing meat, milk, and urine? Then he's thinking like, well, how did the grass get there? What's it coming from? And so he's thinking the grass is like a semi-solid form of water that goes into this creature that's also made up of water, and some solid, some liquid, and that's how he sees life in the world. So the more compressed, compacted water becomes, it becomes solid, and the more aerated it becomes, it turns into a vapor. And so humans, as we know, someone looked this up for me the other day, it was around 70%. We're made up around 70% water, and that is really trippy to think about. But we don't look like water, but we are. Any thoughts on Thales? Now, most people today would say everything is not made of water, but if you get that Dictionary of Creation Myths books, a lot of the creation myths, including the Genesis account, begin with water already in existence. Okay? And the Spirit of God hovered upon the face of the waters. It's there at the beginning of creation. Okay, nope. So what I want you to remember about Thales, he's the first out the chute. He gets the title of father of Western philosophy, and he gets this because he's not looking to the gods or superstition. He's using human reason and observation, and that's how he's coming up with these ideas. Now the next guy, Anaximander, who came after Thales and respected Thales, but he said, if everything came from water, then water should be everywhere. How could we have all these differentiations? He said, we can't pick something for the underlying substance of all things that we can actually see. It has to be something below that, something sub the elements that we see in this world. And so Anaximander said, it can't be anything that we can label or name or necessarily even observe. So he called it the indeterminate.
Called water the indeterminate?
No. He's saying the indeterminate is below water. And from the indeterminate comes water, earth, air,
Fire.
the basic Greek 4 elements. But the underlying element has to be indistinguishable from any of those things. It has to be sub any of those manifestations. And this is what I wrote about him. I said, Anaximander had a hard time accepting Thales' supersubstance of water. For is not water itself the opposite of land, and wet the opposite of dry? How could one of the opposite manifestations of the ultimate reality, should not the ultimate source of all matter be beyond opposites, right? And that makes a lot of sense. How can we posit something as like wet or dry or hard or soft? How can that bring the totality of all things? It has to be something below those distinctions. And this is really tripping me out because I'm also a studier of world religions. And at the same time in China, we have Lao Tzu writing the Tao Te Ching. There's some debate about that, but I'm going with that one for today, okay? And he's the one, and if you're familiar with Taoism, they have this concept of yin-yang. And in yin-yang, you have these opposites. Light and dark, male and female, black and white, soft and hard, etc. And contained within the other is the seed of its opposite. And so what Anaximander is saying is, we have to look for something below the surface of these opposites, beyond wet and dry, but beyond earth and dry land. But think about the Genesis account. That's exactly how the creation starts, right? You have this God beyond distinction, and then he begins to make this dualistic world. The first thing he does, light and darkness, right? Then he separates the waters, and then he separates the waters from the dry land. And so you keep seeing these divisions, and then, right, male and female, right? We get all these divisions taking place. And so Anaximander is basically saying, I'm actually going to read from the first chapter of the Tao. This is Lao Tzu, but he's writing the same time Anaximander is writing. Tao in Chinese, it can be translated as the way, but it would be much better, I think. I believe it's the philosophical equivalent to the Greek word logos. And anyone know what the logos?
Logic.
Logic, that's one. And then the King James translated as the word. We see it in John 1. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. Okay, so it can mean cosmic consciousness, universal reason, and this is from the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao, or if you want to say the Urstoff, or that which is beyond or below all things. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The unnameable is the eternally real. Naming is the origin of all particular things. Free from desire, you realize the mystery. Caught in desire, you see only the manifestations. Yet mystery and manifestation arise from the same source. This source is called darkness. Darkness within darkness, the gate of all mystery. And so in Taoism, and I don't know if this is what Anaximander was going for. I'm sure feeling the same vibe. But he wants to get to this place before the division, which would look something like, start over. So out of the one comes the two. From the two comes the three. And then out of the three comes all things. But what you have to realize is this is in this, and this is in this, and all of this is contained within the one. But that one cannot be named, it cannot be distinguished, you can't see it from anything else. But from that source, everything comes. And so this is the task of the Greeks. They're looking for this underlying substance. And I think the attitude of the day towards Anaximander was, if you don't know what it is, just say so. You can't just make up stuff and say, oh, I know what it is, but I can't put a name to it. But I think he was just in a whole different place than his contemporaries. And I love Anaximander. I think he was really shooting for a high-end type of knowledge. But the Greeks wanted something more concrete, more material. You can see how much more abstract and esoteric Anaximander was. All right, that was a lot. Any questions? I'm starting to get some glazed looks. Okay. Next up. So what I want you to remember for Anaximander is he believed we couldn't name or categorize what that one thing was. It was beyond human knowledge or expression. Next up is Anaximenes. Let's see if I spelled it right. Anaximenes. Close. Aren't these great names? And he believed the underlying substance of all things was air. So instead of water, he went with air. And in addition, he added to this concept of compression and rarefication. So he believes solid objects are really just hyper-compressed air. So your physical body would be super compressed air, and your soul or spirit or thoughts would be like rarefied air. And here's a little experiment to test this theory. If you take your hand, go ahead and try this, blow a stream of air into your hand, like a compressed stream of air. Now yawn into your hand. Do you feel how solid that compressed stream felt and cooler? And then the other was warm and hot? What further need have we of witnesses? But I love this thinking. I love the idea. Obviously, we don't think everything's made up of air today, but you gotta love how these Greeks are systematically trying to go through, and you can see we're on our way to getting to the 4 Greek elements, right? Earth, air, fire, water. And different people are championing different one of these elements. So for Anaximenes, he went back to what Thales was doing. He just picked a different element. Next out of the chute, completely changes the paradigm, and this is Pythagoras. And not only did he come up with a unique idea, anyone want to take a guess what Pythagoras thought the Earth off was? What's it?
Fire.
Nope.
Earth.
You were on it earlier.
Numbers.
Numbers. He thought the underlying substance of all things was numbers, that we could describe the entire universe through numbers. Oh, if he was living today, he would just go crazy with delight, right? With binary code and all of that. Because literally, on your little screens, in your little boxes, that's all numbers that's being interpreted and translated as colors, shapes, sounds, but it's just zeros and ones. How crazy is that? I mean, it's just, Pythagoras was like, yeah, that's what I've been saying. But it's not just in your little boxes, it's everywhere. In this room, everything could be related to numbers. In fact, they created like this whole like little cult thing, well, called commune. Let's do commune. And they were very egalitarian. Women were welcome, and this is kind of, they were taught, educated, they were white, they were vegetarians. They created the octave scale in the West because they saw the relation between links of catgut or wire and the tones that it would make. And so we have our octave scale coming from the Pythagoreans. And they believed that was a microcosm of what was happening in the heavens, where they called it the singing or the harmony of the spheres, or even the planets doing their circuits. And yes, the ancients understood. I mean, this whole idea of terracentric and all that has not always been the case, but they understood there were other planets, there were other bodies out there moving, and they believed they gave off a certain musical sound or quality. But you could take something as simple as, you know, from the 1, or we could even call this 0, comes male, represented by 1, and female, or we could say man, woman, and the number of child would be 3. And so you just begin this building blocks, and you can construct a numerical representation of everything in the world. And if you are a mathematician, or you have a mathematician, or friends that are into physics or the hard sciences, they will use numbers and mathematics to try to describe the world, right? And our mathematics is incredible right now, what we are able to calculate and describe in those sorts of terms. Now, a few odd things about the Pythagoreans. You probably all know the a squared plus b squared equals c squared, right? I mean, so we all have kind of an inkling, even those math challenged people like me, of Pythagoras, but they had much more than that. But they also believed in the transmigration of the soul. And I think this is super interesting. That good enough? So remember, the Pythagoreans believed numbers were the underlying substance. Anyone want to take a guess at what the transmigration of the soul is?
Reincarnation.
Bingo. Well done. Reincarnation. So basically believed this body is just a vehicle, but your essential self, when this vehicle was no longer functioning, would move on into another vehicle. And so this would help explain their veganism, because you don't want to be eating someone you knew that happens to be in a new vehicle you didn't remember. And you see this even in India and other places where some Hindus, they are vegetarians because they don't want to eat reincarnated loved ones, or maybe their children or former spouse or whatever. So, super interesting. They also wouldn't eat beans, however, which I get. Because if you've ever opened like a bean, especially a big one like a kidney or a lima bean, and they already have kind of like skin on the outside, and then you open them up and there's like that little embryo thing inside, and it's just kind of like, nope, too close. So no beans, no meat, egalitarian. I just think of them as kind of like intellectual math hippies or something of the 6th century BC. Okay, wow, I'm doing good. 2 more, and I'll let you go today. We have till 12:15, right? Okay, good. Next up is fire. Good. Is that sound right? I actually don't have an Earth guy, so maybe that's lost writings we have or something, or maybe I just missed it in my studies, but we've got our Earth, fire, our air, fire, and water now. And Heraclitus was actually from Ephesus, and he was called the Dark One. He's writing around 470 BC, so still 5th century BC. And he's called the Dark One because what he realized was, like fire, even though it appears the same, it's always changing and nothing stays the same. So his little jingle, if you want to remember him in one little sentence, it's like, everything changes except change itself. Or you could say everything is in a constant state of flux, just like fire. Which means you can never go home again. And this is part of why he was called the Dark One. And some of you may have experienced this. You went home during the Christmas break, and you went home to be with your families and friends, but you quickly discovered they were not the same family and friends that you had left when you went off to school. They had changed. And what they discovered was you, the person that they had sent off lovingly and that had come back to them, was not the same person that left. This is why every day when I leave the house, I tell my family I love them, because I realize I will never see them again. Because the people, when I go home tonight, the people that will be in that house are not the people that I left this morning. They have changed. I have changed. And it's even worse than that. I'm not just talking about subjective change. This is not the classroom you were in a week ago Tuesday, or 2 weeks ago Tuesday. Because it has physically changed. You might say, no, it's the same color, it's the same weird lighting, it's the same cool, funky, orange 70s chairs, but think about the atomic interchange that's taken place over this week. Think about the changes, or 2 weeks, think about the changes you've been through in 2 weeks. I hope this isn't too upsetting to you, but this is the last class you will ever have with me. Because the Fred who shows up here Thursday will not be the Fred that walks out the door today. Fascinating. Fire. I'll give you a little bit of ethics with Heraclitus, because Heraclitus believed that things that are drier are more ethical and moral, and things that are damp and moist are more impure and evil. So what kinds of things would be dry that you could seek in life? And don't just think physically, think abstractly as well, although physical would apply.
Humor.
Dry humor? See, that's the best kind, isn't it? The like super, super dry where you're not even sure if people are joking. That's always my favorite kind of humor. Slapstick, I enjoy, but that would be like damp humor, right? As opposed to dry humor. Dry humor is much more subtle. What other things are dry? Theology, philosophy, right? Mathematics. That stuff will dry out your soul, people. And that's what Heraclitus wants you to do. But things like the arts, music, drama, those sorts of things, sex, drugs, rock and roll, that is dampness. That will putrefy and moisten your soul, and it'll let all sorts of creepy, damp, moldy things get in there and grow. There's actually, I teach anthropology here as well, and I know you people think I'm making this up, but there is this group of people in the South Pacific, and they are the people of who, it sounds like a Dr. Seuss book, and the principle of nu.
I think I've heard of it.
And the people of who believe that men are dry and women are damp. And so the young men do not want to be around young women because they don't want to lose their masculine dry vitality. Where women actually gain in strength the more they are with women because they are taking their drying themselves out while dampening the men. Okay, this would make such a great antiperspirant commercial. So in the land of who, the principle of nu is you wanted to be dry. So the men would live alone in their longhouses, and they would eat dry things like dry fish, jerky, nuts, things like that. Where the women, you know, with their succulent melons and their sauces and all this stuff, but the men wanted to avoid that. The only women who were allowed to hang out with the young bucks were women past menopause. Because what happens to women after menopause? They begin to dry out, right? And as they become drier, they're not a threat to the young men. And what happens to older men who have been around women for most of their, look at me. I used to be like a jackrabbit. I had leathery skin, you could see every muscle, and now I'm just this big, soft, damp, whatever, nurturingness, right? So old men get damper while older women get drier as they travel through life. And so, surprise, surprise, this culture thinks dryness is a virtue and dampness is a vice. So once said, there's your South Pacific sexism, I guess, or misogyny. But it's so interesting when you trace it back to Heraclitus, and he's seeing this concept of dryness as virtue and value, and dampness as that which corrupts or breakdowns or, you know, brings rot into life. As far as I know, I'm not sure if this is a true story or not, but supposedly Heraclitus on his way home one day tripped and stubbed his toe, and he thought it was a sign from the gods that he should kill himself, so he did. But if you saw Pocahontas, they actually do a Heraclitus song when she's like going down the river, right? And that was one of his, I don't know if he actually said this, but what was attributed to him was the saying, you can never step in the same river twice. Because when you step into a river, even your next step, it's a different river, right? Yeah. And not to mention, you're different, the world, everything's different. So you can never go home, you can never step in the same river twice. And fire is such a great element because even though it is the same, it's always changing. Now, he's the first one that I know of any cosmology with. And what Heraclitus believed was at the center of the cosmos, and here's the first word for the title of the book, he believed there was a cosmic egg. And this cosmic egg exploded. And into this cosmic explosion swirled the world as we know it. Now here's a little etymology for you. The cosmos in Greek means order, as opposed to chaos, which means chaos. Right? We still use that word in English today to mean disorder, right? Disorder. So when the Greeks looked at the cosmos, what they were saying is we see order. It's not just this random chaos, big bang explosion. There is some sort of order or unity or symmetry going on out there. And we can see that even in like the spiral of the galaxies that follow like the Fibonacci sequence, right? Or the golden mean, the golden ratio. And we'll get into that later. But so we have this spiraling universe, and out of these spirals, we get planets, sun, moon, stars, not to proportion, comet, all this stuff is going on out there. And then on the planet, you know, we get male, female, trees, coffee mugs. That's Fred's world. So out of this cosmic egg, this explosion, he calls it the fiery ether, like this gaseous substance that everything's kind of swirling and coming into being. But there is this concept or principle, this cosmic principle that is ordering all things. And he calls this the Logos. Whoa. And once again, it can be translated as word or intellect, but Heraclitus is defining this as universal reason or cosmic consciousness. Gotta like cosmic consciousness, right? And so from everything from like salt crystals to migratory patterns of geese, the Logos is ordering and directing these sorts of things. But humans are unique in that we actually have the Logos within. And so here we have this fire at the center of the universe in the Logos, and the Logos is ordering all things, but that same fire is what is inside human beings. And that's how we can tell what is the good, the true, the beautiful, how we can reason, how we can make value judgments. Fascinating. But he's still a materialist, because even that fire inside of us that we're made up of, it's still physical material. It's not spirit, it's still matter, just very rarefied matter. Do I have time for one last one?
Yeah.
Okay. Last guy, this was the disciple of Heraclitus, and his name is Parmenides. Let me just make sure I spell his name right for you. All right, Parmenides. Messing up my E's and I's. Parmenides. And like any good disciple, his job is to one-up his master. And so his little jingle was, you can never step in the same river once.
That's trash.
And so one would think, until you begin to hear his reasons why. Because he, like Anaximander, said, we can't break it up into a bunch of little things, because the reality is, there is only one thing. And what Parmenides means by this, I'm not supposed to use the sweet spot, let me. Parmenides believes the totality of reality is one. So there's nothing that's existing outside of that. But if there's only one thing, it also means there's only one place. Right? It's like what I was telling you about God the other day. How God can't go outside. Because if God's everywhere, there's nowhere for him to go. Also, do you guys know the theological concept of the simplicity of God? Any Bible majors in here? What is the simplicity of God? All right, I'll just tell you. It means he cannot be divided. A lot of people like to say, well, but what about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Those are three persons of one being. You can't split God into thirds or into parts or into fourths or whatever you want to do it. God is one, God is complete, God is whole. But if God is the totality of reality, how can God go anywhere? How can God move? How can there be more than one thing if he is complete and united? Now, he wasn't talking about God. He was just talking about this underlying substance of all things. And once again, this is what's so freaky to my mind is he's a materialist. He believes there is only one material thing. And a lot of people just mocked him. They said, come on, dude. It's obviously there's more than one thing. But he had a buddy named Zeno who was a mathematician. And he specialized in paradoxical arguments to explain why, indeed, there is only one thing and why movement and division are not possible. And I'm going to leave you with this to trip on. Does someone have a scratch piece of paper for me? I'm going to eviscerate it. Okay. So let's take this for example. If we take this piece of paper, and this is one of Zeno's paradoxes, and we divide this piece of paper in half, and then to half again, and again, and again. Theoretically, how many times can I do this? Yeah, an infinite amount of times. I just keep dividing it, right? Do you see the problem? If I can divide this piece of paper an infinite amount of times, doesn't that make it infinitely large? Which means everything should be full of paper, which is obviously nonsense. Let me give you another example. He explained why the hare could never catch the tortoise in a race. Because every time, and I don't know if you did timelines when you were in high school, but we started like this, right? And start with 0, 1, 2, and then my teacher put a little arrow on it. This is like 7th grade. I was way behind in math. So we get there, and he goes, that means it goes infinite number in that direction. And then he did this. He goes, but you can also go -1, -2, etc. And you can go this in an infinite amount that direction. And I was still cool. But then he did something horrible to me. He said, did you realize there's also an infinite amount of numbers between 0 and 1? And I said, no, shut your mouth, there are not. But he said, sure there are, Fred. There's 1/2, 1/4, 1/8. And you know, if I had a small enough pen, I could just keep going an infinite amount. But what that means, Ryan, there's an infinite amount of space between us. For me to get to you, I would first have to get to the halfway point between us. What's your name? Again?
Justin.
Justin, right. So for me to get to you, first I would have to get to the halfway point, which is Justin. But to get to Justin, first I would have to get to the halfway point between me and him, which would be like that phone. But before I could get to that phone, I'd have to get to the halfway point here. But there's an infinite amount of space between us, Ryan. So how could I ever get to you? And these are part of Zenos paradoxes to show the problem of, wait a second, what is going on right now? And in a lot of ways, I would say Parmenides is actually much more scientifically accurate from what we know of physics today than even his great teacher Heraclitus. So, fun first day with you guys back, and I'm so sorry I won't get to teach you again. Have a good life.